10 seconds before the world changed. November 27th, 2020. Local time 1527. Absard, Iran. For the rest of the world, this was just an ordinary Friday. In London, traders were closing their books before the weekend. In Washington, analysts were filing situation reports that no one would read until Monday. And in Tel Aviv, an unnamed building had been wrapped in a heavy silence for 3 days. But on a 2-lane road outside the village of Absard, a road too unremarkable to appear on most maps of Iran, a black Nissan Teana was moving at 85 kilometers per hour. Inside that car sat a man who had spent 30 years mastering the art of invisibility. In just 2 years, he had changed his phone and number 17 times. His routes were in constant rotation. He traveled with an 11-man security detail. He slept at different locations on a schedule so complex that even his closest associates rarely knew where he would be on any given night. His name was Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And somewhere, perhaps above him, perhaps already alongside him, embedded in the asphalt, woven into the very infrastructure of the road, a system was watching. At 15:27 and 40 seconds, the first detonation occurred. The first phase of the blast was not designed to kill him. It was designed to stop him. And everything that unfolded in the next 90 seconds had been rehearsed, not in Iran, not anywhere near a border, but at a facility in the Negev desert, on a replica of this exact road, constructed from satellite imagery accurate to within 30 centimeters. This is not a story about an assassination. This is a story about a 40-year intelligence architecture executing its terminal command. To understand why Mohsen Fakhrizadeh had to be neutralized on that highway in November 2020, you need to go back, not to 2015, not to the JCPOA negotiations, not even to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. You need to go back to 1957. The year Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion formalized what strategists would later call the Periphery Doctrine. This geopolitical framework was so coldly rational that it read less like foreign policy and more like a mathematical theorem. The logic was straightforward. Israel cannot win a war of attrition against its neighbors. The Arab states bordering Israel will always hold the numerical and strategic upper hand by sheer demographic and geographic necessity. Therefore, Israel must forge strategic alliances with non-Arab states beyond that ring: Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, creating a second perimeter to neutralize the first. For 22 years it worked. The Shah of Iran and Israeli intelligence shared assets. Iranian oil flowed to Haifa's refineries. Israeli agricultural technology transformed Iranian farmland. Mossad and Savak, Iran's imperial-era secret police, trained together, sometimes in the same buildings. Then came 1979. The revolution didn't just change Iran's government, it detonated the Periphery Doctrine from within. Israel's most valuable non-Arab partner became its most committed existential enemy overnight. But what most analysts miss about this transition is the following. The hostility was political. The intelligence infrastructure, like the networks, the psionim, the deep cover assets embedded across Iranian society through decades of cooperation, that infrastructure did not vanish overnight. Some of it went dormant, some of it was burned, but some of it simply waited. By 1984, Iranian military doctrine had begun to shift. The devastating experience of the Iran-Iraq War, a war in which Iraqi chemical weapons killed Iranian soldiers by the tens of thousands with near total impunity, left a permanent and jarring mark on the Islamic Republic. The lesson was clear. Conventional military power is not enough. Asymmetric deterrence demands asymmetric weapons. It was from this conviction that the first seeds of Iran's nuclear program were planted. In 1989, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh stepped onto the stage. He was getting on in years, a trained officer within the Revolutionary Guards, a quiet man. He never drew attention to himself. He neither appeared in photographs nor stood out at conferences. Discretion and silence had always been his most defining qualities. Yet the reports circulating at the highest levels of Iranian intelligence at the time spoke of him as one of the most brilliant and dangerous minds Iran had ever produced. In the decades that followed, Fakhrizadeh would go on to run Project Ahmad, operating under multiple cover identities, the program that formed the backbone of Iran's nuclear weapons design effort. By the early 1990s, Mossad had been hearing his name with increasing frequency, and within that unnamed building in Tel Aviv, a new file was opened. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was an extraordinarily difficult man to read. He was not the kind of threat that flaunted its power or issued warnings. He gave no interviews. He held court at no podiums. He was not the public face of the nuclear program, and he never wanted to be. He was the program's architect. In other words, Fakhrizadeh was not a target. He was a system. And killing the system was far harder than killing the man. Mossad understood this perfectly. In 2007, the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency published a report raising serious concerns about possible military dimensions in Iran's nuclear file. Fakhrizadeh was the only Iranian scientist mentioned by name, repeatedly. The agency requested to speak with him. Iran refused. That refusal was, on its own, an intelligence assessment. An ordinary academic or civilian nuclear physicist does not hide from IAEA investigators. The degree to which Fakhrizadeh's existence was being shielded was the clearest possible signal of how critical he was. His security routine appeared in Mossad's files as follows: an 11-man protective detail that drew immediate attention, a constant and systematic rotation of routes, a vehicle convoy equipped with frequency jammers, phone communications conducted exclusively through encrypted channels, and a public presence of precisely 0. Yet no matter how meticulously a system is designed, it always carries a point of vulnerability. Fakhrizadeh's weakness was the most predictable aspect of human nature: routine. Paranoid men change their routes, change their residences, change their phones. But there is one thing none of them can change: the time they spend with the people they love. Fakhrizadeh's summer house in Absard was not a retreat. It was a sanctuary. And during the periods he spent there with his family, and even under pressure, his security protocol showed a slight loosening. Mossad watched that window for years, measured it, modeled it. By mid-2020, Mossad analysts had identified 3 critical factors converging at once. First, Iran's uranium enrichment activities were approaching a critical threshold. By some estimates, the country was 12 to 18 months away from producing weapons-grade material. Second, the U.S. presidential election had concluded with Biden's victory. Israeli intelligence circles assessed that the incoming administration would pursue diplomatic engagement with Iran, and that this window would soon close. Third, and perhaps most critically, behavioral analysis of Fakhrizadeh's patterns indicated he would be traveling to Absard that November weekend. 3 factors aligned simultaneously, and in that building in Tel Aviv, the one that had been dark and silent for 3 days, movement had begun. A Mossad operation begins long before the moment of the kill. The operative who pulls the trigger or presses the button in the field is the final link in a long chain. What comes before is months, sometimes years, of intelligence architecture carefully constructed. And each layer of that architecture is placed so precisely atop the last that outside observers see only the outcome, never the skeleton beneath. For the Fakhrizadeh operation, that architecture consisted of several critical components. First component, the local asset network. The structure known in Israeli intelligence literature as Sayanim, volunteer or paid local assets living in foreign countries who provide support for Mossad operations, was extremely limited and extremely valuable inside Iran. Much of the post-revolution Sayanim network in Iran had either been purged or had gone deep into dormancy. But certain sources, particularly networks maintained through family connections established before 1979 and preserved across generations, remained active. For this operation, the role of local assets was critical in positioning the Zamyad truck at that specific stretch of road near Absard. Moving military hardware into Iran's interior as a foreigner is nearly impossible, but with the right networks and the right cover identities, that seemingly impossible logistical problem becomes solvable. Second component, communications. Intelligence and signal analysis, Fakhrizadeh, was known to conduct his phone communications through encrypted channels, but encryption does not conceal metadata. Who communicates with whom and when, not the content but the pattern, is an extraordinarily valuable source of intelligence. Units operating in coordination with the NSA, alongside Israel's own signals intelligence capability, the structure known as Unit 8200, spent years mapping Fakhrizadeh's communication patterns. The purpose of this work was not to determine where he was, but to predict where he would be. Modeling a target's future location through communication patterns is one of the most sophisticated disciplines in modern intelligence. In Fakhrizadeh's case, this modeling had, in all likelihood, anticipated the Absard visit several weeks in advance. Third component, weapons deployment. This is where the most technically complex and contested dimension of the operation begins. How the weapon system used in this operation, a hybrid remote-controlled platform combining a machine gun and explosives, was smuggled into Iranian territory remains one of the questions the intelligence world has not yet fully answered. The most likely scenario, the system was brought in piece by piece, through different channels at different intervals, then assembled on the ground. The second possibility, the system was activated from a deep cover cache that had lain dormant for decades. Both scenarios are consistent with Mossad's historically documented operational capacity. Fourth component, operational security, designing plausible deniability. One of the most critical requirements of any state-sponsored operation is ensuring, in the aftermath, what is known as plausible deniability. This means leaving a gap wide enough for the sponsoring state to officially deny involvement, even as the rest of the world draws its own conclusions. The Fakhrizadeh operation stands as a near-perfect example of this principle. None of the operatives in the field were Israeli, or at least no evidence was ever found to prove they were. The systems used were composed of commercially available components. Communication traces had been erased. The truck used in the operation was partially destroyed afterward. Israel neither claimed nor denied responsibility, and that silence was the loudest confession of all. We now enter the most technical portion of the operation, and it's worth pausing here for a moment. What follows is not an instruction manual for violence, it is an engineering analysis. Because the Fakhrizadeh operation stands as one of the first instances in intelligence history where a remote-controlled weapon system was used in an assassination with this degree of sophistication, and that makes it a strategic inflection point. The system: robotic machine gun platform. Iranian officials and numerous independent researchers describe the weapon system used in the operation as follows: a machine gun platform mounted in the bed of the blue Zamyad truck, remotely controlled via satellite link, equipped with an AI-assisted targeting algorithm. This system required no human operator at the trigger. The operatives could have been hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers away at the moment of execution. The most detailed technical account of the system came from Iranian Armed Forces Chief of Staff General Hossein Bagheri. According to Bagheri, the weapon was a specially calibrated machine gun capable of firing 500 rounds per minute, and it had been mounted in the truck's cargo bed with such precision that from the outside it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary load. But how did the targeting work? That is where the true engineering elegance of this operation lies. In addition to a standard optical targeting camera, the system was integrated with a facial recognition algorithm. This algorithm had been calibrated using visual intelligence materials gathered in advance to identify Fakhrizadeh's face even in a dense traffic environment. What this meant was the following. The system was capable of identifying the target inside a moving vehicle and making the decision to open fire not through human operator confirmation, but through algorithmic verification. This bears emphasis if these descriptions are accurate, and multiple independent sources support these technical specifications. Then the Fakhrizadeh operation represents the first documented case in which AI-assisted autonomous targeting was used in a real-world assassination. That carries a strategic significance far beyond the death of one man. It is a preview of future warfare doctrine. The explosive component. This was not a system limited to a machine gun alone. The first detonation at 1527 was a bomb specifically designed to stop Fakhrizadeh's vehicle, triggered by a separate explosive mechanism. This two-phase approach, stop first, neutralize second, is a pattern seen in previous Mossad operations. It was designed to trap the target in the vehicle, momentarily disorient the security detail, and give the machine gun a clean firing window. Each phase had the potential to fail. None of them did. At 15:27 and 40 seconds, the first detonation occurred. Fakhrizadeh's black Nissan Tiana braked sharply. The security detail scattered. For a few seconds, those few seconds that represented the most critical interval in Mossad's entire plan, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Fakhrizadeh stepped out of the vehicle. The moment he stepped out, he had signed his own death warrant. Had he remained inside the armored car, its protective structure would have bought at least a meaningful delay. But this is what happens even to the best-trained protective details in the world during a moment of crisis. They act on human instinct. And human instinct is a variable that algorithms account for. The machine gun opened fire. According to official records, Fakhrizadeh was struck by approximately 13 rounds. All impacts were concentrated on the torso and neck. Among his close protection detail, there were no fatalities, only a few injuries. But the targeting algorithm, if these claims are accurate, demonstrated a clear discrimination capability. The overwhelming majority of rounds had been concentrated on Fakhrizadeh alone. The operation was over in minutes, not hours. Fakhrizadeh was rushed to hospital. 45 minutes later, he was dead. Aftermath: official denial and strategic damage. In the wake of Fakhrizadeh's death, Iran issued sharp accusations against Israel. After expressing grief over Fakhrizadeh's killing, Khamenei stated that the blood of their heroic scientist would not go unavenged and that a severe response would follow. Israel neither confirmed nor denied. That silence is the standard postscript to a Mossad operation. There is no confirmation because confirmation is not necessary. The message has already been delivered. But how much damage did the operation actually inflict on Iran's nuclear program? The answer to that question is precisely what explains why Mossad had carried Fakhrizadeh as a priority target for decades. According to Western intelligence assessments, Fakhrizadeh was the irreplaceable central nervous system of Iran's nuclear weapons program. He was not merely a scientist, he was institutional memory. Decades of accumulated technical expertise, the methodologies he had developed, the human cadres he had trained, all of it was bound to his continued existence. Did Iran's nuclear program stop after his death? No. Did it slow down? Yes. And the timeline required to reach certain technical thresholds was extended by some estimates by 2 to 4 years. In the intelligence world, this is called buying time, and in this part of the world, time is the most valuable strategic resource of all. Geopolitical consequences. A redrawn map, Fakhrizadeh's elimination did not affect only Iran's nuclear program. It directly shaped the JCPOA negotiations that would begin with the incoming Biden administration. Iran came to the table in a weakened position, both in terms of technical capacity and domestic political dynamics. The operation also sent Israel's red line message back to regional actors with renewed force. Certain thresholds in the nuclear program will not be permitted, and this time the message was delivered not in words but in action. Finally, the operation placed a still unanswered question squarely on the table. How should the use of autonomous weapon systems by state actors for assassination purposes be evaluated under international law? That question remains open to this day. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh had spent 30 years trying to remain invisible, and for 30 years he largely succeeded. But the coldest truth of the intelligence world is this: no one can remain invisible forever, especially if they remain an essential part of a system. On November 27, 2020, 10 seconds past 15:28, Iran's most closely guarded secret lost his life on a road near Absard, and the world still hasn't fully understood what happened or how. The body of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was buried 3 days after the operation. The funeral was attended by senior Revolutionary Guard commanders, government officials, and scientists whose names will never appear in any public record. Supreme Leader Khamenei sent a personal condolence letter. State television broadcast carefully selected footage, and within 48 hours the official narrative was already being constructed. A martyr, a hero, a man killed by the enemies of the Islamic Republic. But in the corridors of Iran's nuclear establishment, the mood was something far more complicated than grief. It was panic. Because the people who understood what Fakhrizadeh actually did, not his title, not his public biography, but the specific irreplaceable function he served. Those people knew that no condolence letter and no state funeral could fill what had just been removed from the program. In intelligence terms, what Mossad had executed was not merely a targeted killing. It was a precise extraction of institutional memory. And institutional memory, unlike equipment or facilities, cannot be rebuilt from a blueprint. It cannot be imported. It cannot be reconstructed from documents. It lives in a person's mind, in their accumulated judgment, in the 1,000 small decisions they make each day that no subordinate ever fully observes or records. Fakhrizadeh had been running Iran's most sensitive weapons research for over 3 decades. He knew which approaches had failed and why. He knew which scientist could be trusted with which information. He knew where the program's real vulnerabilities were, and he knew how to protect them. He was, in the language of systems analysis, a single point of failure, the one node whose removal would send cascading disruptions through every connected system, and Mossad had removed him with surgical precision. Within weeks of the assassination, Western intelligence agencies began observing subtle but significant changes in Iranian nuclear communications patterns. Coordination between facilities became slower. Decision cycles lengthened. Research directives that would previously have been issued within days began taking weeks. The program did not stop, but it began to move with the hesitancy of an organization that had lost its center of gravity. Iran's response was swift in rhetoric and slower in substance. The Islamic Republic announced that 100 Fakhrizadehs would rise to take his place. New scientists were promoted. New organizational structures were announced. But the intelligence community watching from the outside noted something telling. The men who replaced Fakhrizadeh were administrators, competent, loyal, experienced administrators. But none of them were Fakhrizadeh. None of them carried 3 decades of weapons-grade nuclear research in their institutional memory. And in the world of covert weapons development, that difference is measured not in titles but in years. Years that Israel had just purchased. But the operation's consequences extended far beyond the walls of Iran's nuclear facilities. In Washington, the assassination landed in the middle of a presidential transition with the force of a carefully placed diplomatic grenade. The incoming Biden team, which had campaigned on returning to the JCPOA framework and re-engaging Tehran through diplomacy, now faced a fundamentally altered landscape. Iran's hardliners, already skeptical of any agreement with the United States, used Fakhrizadeh's killing as confirmation that engagement was a trap. Why negotiate, they argued, when your scientists are being eliminated regardless of whether you sit at the table? The moderates in Tehran who had supported the original nuclear deal found their political ground collapsing beneath them. The assassination had handed the hardliners exactly the narrative they needed, that America and Israel operated as a unified front, that diplomacy was theater, and that only deterrence, real, credible, nuclear deterrence, could guarantee the Islamic Republic's survival. In this sense, the operation achieved something paradoxical. It slowed Iran's nuclear program in the short term, but it may have strengthened the ideological argument for that program in the long term. This is the nature of covert operations at the highest strategic level. They are never simply tactical. Every action reshapes the environment in which the next action must be taken. And the environment that emerged from November 27, 2020, was one in which Iranian domestic politics had shifted perceptibly toward those who believed that the bomb was not an option but a necessity. Meanwhile, in a different kind of room, in a different kind of building, a different kind of question was being asked. The Fakhrizadeh operation had introduced something genuinely new into the calculus of state-sponsored violence. An autonomous weapon system guided by artificial intelligence, capable of identifying and engaging a specific human target without a human finger on the trigger at the moment of firing. Legal scholars, arms control experts, and military ethicists began grappling with what this meant. Under existing international humanitarian law, the use of lethal force requires human judgment at the point of decision. A soldier pulling a trigger is legally and morally accountable in ways that an algorithm is not. When a machine identifies a face, locks a targeting reticle, and opens fire, who bears responsibility for that decision? The question had no clean answer in 2020. It has no clean answer today. What the Fakhrizadeh operation demonstrated is that the technological barrier to autonomous lethal targeting had already been crossed. Not in a laboratory, not in a classified test, but in a live operational environment, on a public road, in broad daylight, against a specific named individual. The implications of this fact rippled quietly through defense ministries and intelligence agencies around the world. If one state had deployed this capability operationally, others would follow. The threshold had been lowered. The precedent had been set. And the international community had no agreed framework for responding to it. In this respect, the road outside Absard was not merely the site of one man's death. It was a threshold, a line crossed. A demonstration that the future of targeted killing had already arrived, and that it arrived not with announcement, but with the clinical silence of a satellite uplink and a targeting algorithm making its decision in milliseconds. The Iranian government eventually released fragments of what it claimed was forensic evidence from the scene, photographs of the damaged truck, ballistic analyses, witness accounts. Each piece was carefully curated to support the official narrative of Israeli aggression. But one detail in the forensic record drew particular attention from weapons analysts studying the case: the grouping of the rounds that struck Fakhrizadeh. In a chaotic ambush environment, with a security detail present and multiple moving elements, the pattern of fire was strikingly concentrated. Not scattered, as one might expect from a human operator managing stress and distance and motion simultaneously. Concentrated. Almost geometric in its precision. It was, analysts noted quietly, the kind of grouping you would expect from a system that did not experience stress, that did not flinch, that did not hesitate. A system that simply identified its target and executed its instruction. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is buried in Tehran. His grave has become a site of official commemoration. His name has been attached to research institutes and academic programs. The Islamic Republic has worked methodically to transform him into a symbol of sacrifice, of resistance, of the cost of pursuing scientific sovereignty against the will of hostile powers. And in a sense, that transformation is itself a kind of intelligence operation, because symbols, unlike scientists, cannot be killed. A martyr is more durable than a program director. A name on a building outlasts the man who bore it. But the program he built, the specific irreplaceable architecture of knowledge and relationships and institutional judgment that he had spent 30 years constructing, that did not survive him intact. And that, in the cold calculus of strategic intelligence, was precisely the point. The invisible war did not end on that highway outside Absard. It never ends. It simply moves to the next file, the next target, the next operation that the world will spend years trying to understand. And somewhere in a building with no name on its door, the next file is already open. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because the next operation is already in motion, and when it surfaces, we will be the first to tell you exactly how it was done.